The rain hammered against the emergency room windows as Dr. Marcus Williams pulled his surgical gloves tight. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in downtown Chicago, and the night had already brought 3 overdoses, 2 stabbings, and a car accident. But nothing could have prepared him for what walked through those sliding doors next. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The emergency room at Chicago General Hospital buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across the linoleum floors that had seen more trauma than most war zones. Dr. Marcus Williams had been working the graveyard shift for 3 years now, ever since completing his residency. At 29, he was younger than most attending physicians, but his steady hands and quick thinking had earned him respect among the nursing staff and fellow doctors alike. Marcus adjusted his stethoscope around his neck and glanced at the clock. The shift was supposed to end at 7 a.m., but he knew better than to expect a quiet remaining few hours. Chicago's streets were unforgiving, especially in this part of town where the hospital served as the last hope for those who had nowhere else to turn. "Dr. Williams, we've got another one coming in," called out Jennifer Martinez, the head nurse whose 15 years of experience showed in every efficient movement she made. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen it all but still cared enough to fight for every patient that came through those doors. "What are we looking at?" Marcus asked, pulling up the collar of his white coat against the air conditioning. That seemed to run perpetually cold. Homeless individual male, appears to be in his 50s, found unconscious behind the Riverside shopping center. Possible hypothermia, multiple lacerations, and... Jennifer paused, consulting her notes. "The paramedic said he was pretty beaten up. Looks like someone worked him over pretty good." Marcus nodded grimly. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. The homeless population in Chicago faced dangers that most people couldn't imagine, from brutal winters that claimed lives to random acts of violence from those who saw them as easy targets. Survival on the streets required a resilience that Marcus deeply respected. The automatic doors burst open with a mechanical whoosh, and the paramedics wheeled in a figure, covered by a blood-stained emergency blanket. Marcus got his first look at the patient as they transferred him to the examination table. The man was indeed in rough shape. His weathered face bore fresh bruises that were already turning purple, and his clothes were torn and dirty. But what struck Marcus most was the man's eyes. Even in his semi-conscious state, there was an intelligence there, a spark that suggested this person had once known better days. "Sir, can you hear me?" Marcus leaned over the patient, his voice gentle but clear. "You're at Chicago General Hospital. My name is Dr. Williams, and we're going to take good care of you." The man's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. When they finally locked onto Marcus's face, there was a moment of surprise, as if he hadn't expected to see a young black doctor in this situation. His lips moved, trying to form words. "Water," he managed to whisper, his voice like sandpaper. "Jennifer, let's get him some ice chips," Marcus instructed while beginning his examination. As his hands moved professionally over the patient's body, checking for injuries, he couldn't help but notice the man's hands. Despite the dirt and calluses, they were well formed, with long fingers that suggested someone who had once worked. With precision and care, the examination revealed multiple concerns. Beyond the obvious signs of assault, bruised ribs, a black eye, and a split lip, the man showed signs of malnutrition and exposure. His body temperature was dangerously low, and there were infected cuts on his arms and legs that suggested he'd been living rough for quite some time. "What's your name, sir?" Marcus asked as he cleaned one of the deeper wounds on the man's forearm. "Thomas," came the reply after a long pause. "Thomas Bennett." "Well, Thomas, you're going to be okay. Some of these cuts are pretty deep, and you've got some bruising that we need to monitor, but nothing that won't heal with proper care." Marcus worked steadily, his movements practiced and sure. "Can you tell me what happened to you?" Thomas closed his eyes, and for a moment Marcus thought he might have fallen unconscious again. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "3 guys, maybe 4, came at me while I was sleeping behind the dumpster." He paused, wincing as Marcus applied antiseptic to a particularly nasty gash. "They thought it was funny, I guess. Kicking around the homeless guy." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard variations of this story too many times. People who saw the homeless as less than human, as acceptable targets for their frustration or cruelty. It never got easier to hear. "Did you get a look at them? Did you report this to the police?" Thomas let out a bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "Police? You think they care about what happens to someone like me? I'm just another piece of garbage on the street to them." As Marcus continued treating Thomas's wounds, he found himself studying the man more closely. Despite the rough exterior and the smell of the streets, there was something about Thomas that suggested depth, education maybe. The way he spoke when he wasn't whispering in pain showed a vocabulary that didn't match his current circumstances. "You weren't always on the streets, were you, Thomas?" The question seemed to surprise the older man. He looked at Marcus with new attention, as if really seeing him for the first time. "No," Thomas said simply. "I wasn't." Marcus waited, but Thomas didn't elaborate. Instead, he closed his eyes and seemed to retreat into himself. Marcus respected the silence and continued his work, carefully stitching the worst of the cuts with the same attention he would give to any patient, regardless of their ability to pay or their station in life. The treatment took nearly 2 hours. Marcus lost track of time as he worked, ensuring every wound was properly cleaned and dressed, every injury catalogued and treated. When he finally stepped back, Thomas looked markedly better, though still fragile. "The good news is that nothing's broken," Marcus explained, pulling off his gloves. "You've got some nasty bruising, and those cuts were getting infected. But with proper care and rest, you should heal up fine. I'm going to prescribe some antibiotics to fight the infection and some pain medication to help with the discomfort." "I can't pay for any of this," Thomas said quietly, looking down at his bandaged hands. "Don't worry about that right now," Marcus replied. "Let's focus on getting you better first." But Marcus knew the reality. Thomas would be discharged in a few hours, sent back out to the same streets where he'd been attacked. The antibiotics would run out, the wounds would be exposed to dirt and the elements again, and there was a good chance the older man would be back in worse condition within a week. "Thomas," Marcus said, pulling up a chair beside the examination table. "Is there anyone I can call for you? Family? Friends?" The question seemed to cause Thomas physical pain. His face crumpled for just a moment before he composed himself. "No," he said simply. "There's no one." Something in the way Thomas said those words struck Marcus deeply. This wasn't just a man who had fallen on hard times. This was someone who had lost everything, including the connections that make life worth living. "How long have you been on the streets?" Marcus asked gently. 3 years, Thomas replied, staring at the ceiling. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. The precision of the answer told Marcus everything he needed to know. This was a man who marked his fall from grace down to the day, someone for whom this life was still foreign and painful rather than simply accepted. As the first light of dawn began filtering through the emergency room windows, Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives forever. But at that moment, neither man could have imagined the extraordinary turn their paths would take, or how this chance encounter in a Chicago emergency room would set in motion events that would redefine everything they thought they knew about justice, redemption, and the unpredictable nature of fate. Marcus Williams had made many difficult decisions in his medical career, but none felt as personally significant as the one he was about to make. As Thomas Bennett lay resting on the hospital bed, Marcus found himself walking to the administrative office with a determination that surprised even himself. The billing department at Chicago General was a maze of cubicles and filing cabinets, overseen by Patricia Hayes, a woman in her 50s who had seen every sob story and excuse imaginable. When Marcus approached her desk that morning, she looked up with the weary expression of someone who knew exactly why he was there. "Dr. Williams, if this is about the homeless patient in bed 7, you know the protocol. We stabilize, we treat. Immediate life-threatening conditions and we discharge. We can't run a charity ward. I want to cover his expenses," Marcus said without preamble. "All of them. The emergency room visit, the medications, everything." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Doctor, that's very noble of you, but do you realize what you're talking about? Between the emergency room fees, the medications, and the extended care he's going to need for those infections, you're looking at several $1,000s. And that's assuming he doesn't come back." Marcus had done the math in his head during the walk to the office. It would represent a significant portion of his monthly salary, money he had been saving for a down payment on a house. But something about Thomas's situation had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't explain. "I understand the costs," Marcus replied firmly. "Please process it as a private payment." Back in the emergency room, Thomas was awake and alert, though still clearly in pain. The color had returned to his face, and the IV fluids had helped restore some of his strength. When Marcus returned to his bedside, Thomas was staring out the window at the city skyline, watching the morning rush hour begin. "The social worker will be by in a few hours," Marcus said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "She'll help you figure out some temporary housing options. There are shelters that can take you in while you recover." Thomas turned to look at Marcus, and there was something unreadable in his expression. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "Caring. Going beyond what you have to do. Most doctors would have patched me up and sent me on my way by now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." Marcus considered the question carefully. It wasn't the first time a patient had asked him something similar, but there was a weight to Thomas's inquiry that demanded honesty. "I became a doctor because I believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity," Marcus said finally, "regardless of their circumstances. You're not just the homeless guy in bed 7. You're Thomas Bennett, and you matter." Something shifted in Thomas's eyes at those words. For just a moment, the guard he had built around himself seemed to lower, revealing a vulnerability that made him seem years younger. "It wasn't always like this," Thomas said quietly. "I had a life once, a good life." Marcus waited, sensing that Thomas was on the verge of sharing something important. "I was married, had a beautiful wife named Sarah. We were trying to start a family." Thomas's voice grew distant, as if he were looking back across years instead of just a few feet. "I worked for a pharmaceutical company, started in the mailroom. When I was 22, worked my way up over 15 years. Sarah used to joke that I knew more about drug development than some of the researchers." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. A pharmaceutical company. This man, lying broken and beaten in a hospital bed, had once been part of the industry that developed the very medications Marcus prescribed every day. "What happened?" Marcus asked gently. Thomas was quiet for so long that Marcus thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Company reorganization. New management came in, decided they needed to streamline operations. 15 years of loyalty, and they let me go with 2 weeks' notice and a severance package that barely covered a month's rent." Thomas's hands clenched into fists under the hospital blanket. Sarah was pregnant. We'd just bought a house, stretched ourselves thin because we thought we had security. Marcus felt his heart breaking for this man. He'd heard similar stories before, dedicated employees cast aside when companies prioritized profit margins over people. But hearing it from someone who was now living on the streets gave it a brutal immediacy. The stress of unemployment, the financial pressure, it was too much for Sarah. She lost the baby at 6 months. Thomas's voice cracked. She blamed me. Said if I had been more careful, more valuable to the company, we wouldn't have lost everything. She left me 6 months. Later, the room fell silent except for the steady beep of medical equipment and the distant sounds of the hospital coming to life around them. Marcus struggled to find words that wouldn't sound hollow or patronizing. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. I tried to rebuild," Thomas continued, as if he needed to tell the whole story now that he'd started. Applied everywhere, but there were always younger candidates, people with more recent experience. I burned through our savings, lost the house, and ended up in a one-room apartment. Then even that became too expensive. How did you end up on the streets? Eviction. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago. I remember because it was Sarah's birthday. I'd been hoping to call her, to tell her I was getting back on my feet. Instead, I spent the night in my car until it got repossessed 2 weeks later. Marcus sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the broken man before him with the successful pharmaceutical professional Thomas had once been. It was a stark reminder of how quickly life could change, how thin the line was between stability and catastrophe. "You never tried to reconnect with the industry, with your old contacts?" Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "You think anyone wants to hire someone who's been living on the streets for 3 years? Even if I cleaned up, got new clothes, found an address to put on applications? There's a gap in my resume that screams unemployable. And the longer it gets, the worse it becomes." The conversation was interrupted by Jennifer Martinez appearing at the bedside with a clipboard and medication schedule. "Mr. Bennett, I need to go over your discharge instructions and make sure you understand how to take these medications," she said in her professional but caring tone. As Jennifer explained the antibiotic regimen and wound care procedures, Marcus watched Thomas's face. The man was listening intently, asking intelligent questions about drug interactions and healing timelines. It was clear that his background in pharmaceuticals had given him a sophisticated understanding of medical treatment that most patients lacked. After Jennifer left, Marcus made another decision that would have long-term consequences. Neither of them could foresee. "Thomas, I want you to have my card," Marcus said, pulling out his wallet and extracting a business card. He wrote his personal cell phone number on the back. "If you need anything, medical attention, someone to talk to, whatever, you call me, day or night." Thomas stared at the card as if it were made of gold. "Doctor, you don't understand. People like me, we don't get second chances. We don't get people who care. Everyone deserves someone who cares," Marcus replied firmly. "Everyone deserves a chance to rebuild." As Thomas prepared to leave the hospital that afternoon, armed with antibiotics, pain medication, and information about local shelters, neither man realized they were setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to one of the most extraordinary reversals of fortune in corporate history. The kindness shown in that Chicago emergency room would echo through the years in ways that would challenge everything both men thought they knew about justice, mercy, and the interconnected nature of human lives. Thomas Bennett walked out of Chicago General Hospital that day carrying more than just medical supplies and treatment instructions. He carried with him something he hadn't felt in over 3 years: hope. And sometimes hope is all it takes to begin the long journey back from the bottom. 6 months after their first meeting, Marcus Williams received a phone call that would change his perspective on resilience forever. It was a Tuesday evening, and he was reviewing patient charts in his apartment when his personal cell phone rang. The number wasn't in his contacts, but something made him answer anyway. "Dr. Williams? This is Thomas Bennett. We met at Chicago General." Marcus immediately recognized the voice, though it sounded stronger, more confident than he remembered. "Thomas! How are you? I've been wondering how you were doing." "I'm calling because I wanted to thank you properly," Thomas said, "and to tell you something I think you'll find interesting." Over the past 6 months, Thomas Bennett had undergone a transformation that bordered on miraculous. The antibiotics Marcus had prescribed had cleared his infections completely, and the personal attention he'd received had given him something more valuable than medicine: motivation. Using the shelter system information the hospital social worker had provided, Thomas had found temporary housing at the Riverside Community Center. Unlike many shelters that only offered overnight stays, Riverside operated a transitional housing program designed to help people rebuild their lives. Thomas had managed to secure a bed in their 90-day program. The program required residents to actively work toward employment or education goals. For most residents, this meant basic job training or GED preparation, but Thomas had different plans. He spent his days at the Chicago Public Library using their free computer access to research the pharmaceutical industry he had once been part of. What he discovered both amazed and appalled him. The industry had changed dramatically in the 3 years since his dismissal. New breakthrough medications were being developed at an unprecedented pace, but the cost of these life-saving drugs had skyrocketed beyond the reach of many patients who needed them most. "Dr. Williams, I've been studying the current state of pharmaceutical pricing," Thomas explained during their phone conversation. "The markup on essential medications is astronomical. Companies are charging desperate patients thousands of dollars for drugs that cost pennies to manufacture." Marcus found himself drawn into the conversation. As an emergency room physician, he'd seen firsthand how medication costs affected patient compliance and outcomes. Too many patients were forced to choose between buying their prescribed medications and paying rent or buying food. "I see it every day," Marcus replied. "Patients who can't afford their heart medications, diabetics rationing insulin. It's heartbreaking." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Thomas continued with growing excitement. "There's a massive gap in the market for affordable, high-quality, generic medications. But here's the thing. I think I know how to fill that gap." During his months of research, Thomas had identified a critical flaw in how most pharmaceutical companies approached generic drug development. They focused on copying existing medications exactly, which required expensive clinical trials and regulatory approval processes. But Thomas had remembered something from his years in the industry. There were hundreds of older, proven drug formulations that had fallen out of patent protection, but were no longer being manufactured because the profit margins were considered too small by major pharmaceutical companies. "These are medications that have been proven safe and effective for decades," Thomas explained to Marcus, "but they're not being produced anymore because the big companies can make more money on newer, patented drugs. Meanwhile, patients are suffering because they can't access affordable versions of medicines that should cost almost nothing to produce." Marcus was fascinated by Thomas's analysis, but he was also concerned about his friend's mental state. "Thomas, this all sounds very interesting, but what are you planning to do with this information? You're still living in a shelter." "Not for much longer," Thomas replied with a confidence that surprised Marcus. "I've been working on something. Dr. Williams, would you be willing to meet me for coffee tomorrow? There's something I want to show you." The next evening, Marcus found himself sitting in a small cafe near the Riverside Community Center, waiting for Thomas to arrive. When the older man walked through the door, Marcus barely recognized him. Thomas had managed to acquire clean, professional-looking clothes from somewhere, and his hair was neatly trimmed. More importantly, he carried himself with a purpose and energy that was completely different from the broken man Marcus had treated 6 months earlier. "You look incredible, Thomas. What's happened to you?" Thomas smiled as he sat down with 2 cups of coffee. "I've remembered who I used to be. More importantly, I've figured out who I want to become." From a worn briefcase, Thomas pulled out a thick folder filled with printed documents, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be business plans. "I've been working on this for 4 months. I want to start a pharmaceutical company." Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. "Thomas, starting a pharmaceutical company requires millions of dollars in capital, regulatory expertise, manufacturing, facilities." "I know it sounds impossible," Thomas interrupted, "but hear me out. I'm not talking about developing new drugs. I'm talking about manufacturing existing formulations that are desperately needed but currently unavailable at reasonable prices." Thomas opened his folder and began spreading documents across the table. The depth of his research was immediately apparent. He had identified over 50 medications that met his criteria, proven safety records, expired patents, and current market. Prices that were artificially inflated due to lack of competition. "Look at this," Thomas said, pointing to a chart he had created. "Metformin, a diabetes medication that's been around for 60 years. The raw materials cost about 12 cents per month supply to produce, but patients are being charged $40 to $60 a month because there's limited generic competition." Marcus studied the documents with growing amazement. Thomas hadn't just identified market opportunities. He had created detailed cost analyses, identified potential suppliers for raw materials, and even researched regulatory requirements for generic drug manufacturing. "This is incredibly thorough work, Thomas, but the startup costs alone would be enormous." "That's where you're wrong," Thomas replied with a grin. "I've found a way to start small and scale up gradually. There's a concept called contract manufacturing. Instead of building our own facilities, we can partner with existing manufacturers who have excess capacity. We provide the formulations and handle the marketing and distribution. They handle the production." Over the next hour, Thomas laid out a business plan that was both ambitious and surprisingly realistic. He had identified a small contract manufacturer in Indiana that specialized in generic drug production but was struggling to find clients. He had researched the FDA approval process for generic medications and discovered it was far less expensive and time-consuming than he had initially thought, especially for drugs with long-established safety records. Most impressively, Thomas had calculated that the entire operation could be started with less than $200,000 in initial capital, a fraction of what major pharmaceutical companies typically invested in new ventures. "Thomas, this is brilliant," Marcus said, genuinely impressed. "But where are you going to get $200,000? Thomas's expression grew serious. "That's the challenge I'm working on now. Traditional banks won't lend to someone with my background and current circumstances. Venture capitalists want to see established management teams and proven track records. So what's your plan?" "I'm going to prove the concept first," Thomas replied. "I've been in contact with the contract manufacturer in Indiana. They're willing to do a small trial run of one medication, metformin, for about $15,000. If I can raise that much money, I can produce enough medication to supply several small pharmacies and prove that the business model works." Marcus sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by what he was hearing. 6 months ago, Thomas Bennett had been a broken man, lying in a hospital bed with no hope and no future. Now he was presenting a sophisticated business plan that could potentially revolutionize access to affordable medications. "How can I help?" Marcus asked. The question seemed to surprise Thomas. "Dr. Williams, you've already done more for me than anyone has in years. I'm not asking for money or—" I didn't ask what you weren't asking for, Marcus interrupted with a smile. I asked how I can help. This isn't just a business opportunity, Thomas. This could actually help my patients and thousands of other people who are struggling to afford their medications. Thomas stared at Marcus for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I never expected. Most people wouldn't. Most people didn't see you the way I saw you that night in the emergency room, Marcus replied. I saw someone who deserved a chance. And now I'm seeing someone who's earned the right to make the most of that chance. As they sat in that small cafe, neither man realized they were witnessing the birth of what would become one of the most successful pharmaceutical companies in American history. But more than that, they were forging a partnership that would ultimately challenge some of the most powerful and ruthless executives in the industry, including some who would stop at nothing to destroy what they were building. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a colleague of Marcus's at Chicago General, had overheard him discussing Thomas's pharmaceutical venture during a break between emergency room shifts. Elena had been listening with growing interest and finally approached Marcus with a proposition that would change everything. Marcus, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about your friend's business plan, Elena said, as they grabbed coffee in the hospital cafeteria. I think you should know. My brother-in-law runs a community health clinic on the south side. They serve primarily uninsured and underinsured patients, and medication costs are killing their budget. Elena explained that the Rodriguez family health center served over 3,000 patients annually, many of whom were diabetic, hypertensive, or dealing with other chronic conditions that required ongoing medication management. The clinic's pharmacy budget had tripled in the past 5 years, forcing them to turn away patients or provide substandard care when they couldn't afford the medications their patients needed. If your friend could really provide quality generic medications at the prices he's talking about, it would be a game changer for our community, Elena continued. And more than that, my brother-in-law, Roberto, has connections with other community health centers across the Midwest. If Thomas can prove his concept works with one clinic, Roberto could potentially connect him with dozens of others. That weekend, Marcus arranged a meeting between Thomas and Roberto Rodriguez at the Community Health Center. The clinic was housed in a converted warehouse in one of Chicago's most economically challenged neighborhoods, but the energy and dedication of the staff was immediately apparent. Roberto Rodriguez was a bear of a man with calloused hands and the direct manner of someone who had spent decades fighting for his community's health. He listened to Thomas's presentation with the skeptical attention of someone who had heard too many promises that never materialized. Mr. Bennett, I appreciate what you're trying to do, Roberto said when Thomas finished explaining his business model. But I need you to understand something. The people we serve here can't afford to be guinea pigs for an untested company. If you promise to supply medications and then fail to deliver, people could die. Thomas nodded solemnly. Mr. Rodriguez, I understand the responsibility. That's why I want to start with just one medication, prove that I can deliver consistent quality and reliable supply, and then expand from there. Which medication are you thinking about? Metformin. It's the most commonly prescribed diabetes medication. It has an excellent safety profile, and the current market price is completely unjustifiable given the production costs. Roberto leaned back in his chair, considering. His clinic served over 400 diabetic patients, and metformin was indeed their most expensive regular medication expense. What kind of price are you talking about? Thomas consulted his notes. Current wholesale price for a month's supply of metformin is $38. I can deliver the same quality medication for $12 and still maintain a healthy profit margin. The room fell silent. Roberto looked at Marcus, then back at Thomas. If you can actually deliver on that promise, you'd save my clinic over $10,000 a month on just that one medication, Roberto said slowly. But how do I know you're not just another pharmaceutical company making promises you can't keep? Thomas reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small bottle. Because I've already done it. The revelation stunned both Marcus and Roberto. Thomas had used his own savings, money he had carefully accumulated from odd jobs and the small stipend from the transitional housing program, to fund a tiny trial production run. Working with the contract manufacturer in Indiana, he had produced 50 bottles of generic metformin. I've had this tested by an independent laboratory, Thomas explained, handing Roberto the lab results. The quality meets or exceeds FDA standards for bioequivalence. The only difference between this and the brand name version is the price. Roberto studied the lab report carefully. As someone who had been working in community health for over 20 years, he knew how to read pharmaceutical testing data. The results were impressive. Thomas's generic metformin was not only equivalent to the brand name version, but actually showed slightly higher purity levels. This is remarkable work, Roberto admitted. But 50 bottles isn't enough to prove sustainability. My patients need to know that if they start taking your medication, you'll be able to keep supplying it month after month. That's exactly what I'm proposing, Thomas replied. I want to start with a 6-month contract to supply metformin for your diabetic patients. If I can prove reliable delivery and consistent quality over that period, we can discuss expanding to other medications. Over the next 2 hours, the 3 men worked out the details of what would become the foundation of Thomas's pharmaceutical empire. Roberto agreed to switch his clinic's metformin supply to Thomas's company, starting with a 3-month trial period. If the quality and delivery proved reliable, he would not only extend the contract, but would also introduce Thomas to his network of community health centers across the region. For his part, Thomas committed to maintaining a minimum 30-day safety stock and agreed to rigorous quality testing protocols. He also agreed to Roberto's most unusual demand, that if Thomas's company ever became profitable enough to go public, the community health centers that had supported him in the early days would receive equity stakes in the company. I've seen too many businesses get started with the help of our community, then abandon us when they become successful, Roberto explained. If we're going to take a risk on you, I want to make sure our patients benefit if you succeed. Thomas agreed without hesitation, a decision that would prove remarkably prescient in the years to come. The next challenge was operational. Thomas needed to establish a legitimate business entity, secure proper licensing, and set up distribution logistics. Marcus found himself becoming increasingly involved in the venture, using his evenings and weekends to help Thomas navigate the regulatory requirements for pharmaceutical distribution. The process was more complex than either of them had anticipated. Thomas needed to obtain a state license as a pharmaceutical wholesaler, register with the DEA for controlled substance handling, and establish relationships with licensed pharmacies. Each step required documentation, fees, and waiting periods that tested their patience and resolve. During this period, Thomas was still living at the Riverside Community Center, but his circumstances were rapidly changing. The transitional housing program had been extended for exceptional cases, and Thomas's business venture clearly qualified as exceptional. More importantly, the small income he was generating from consulting work, helping other pharmaceutical companies analyze generic drug opportunities, was allowing him to save money for the first time in years. The breakthrough moment came when Thomas received approval for his pharmaceutical wholesale license. Standing in the cramped office space he had rented above a Chicago pharmacy, holding the official state document that legitimized his business, Thomas felt a surge of emotion that nearly overwhelmed him. Affordable Wellness Pharmaceuticals, he said aloud, reading the company name he had chosen. It's really happening. Marcus, who had driven over immediately after receiving Thomas's call, looked around the sparse office space with amazement. File cabinets lined one wall, a single desk held Thomas's computer and phone, and boxes of business cards and letterhead were stacked in the corner. It wasn't much, but it represented something extraordinary. A homeless man had built a legitimate pharmaceutical company from nothing but determination and intelligence. "Thomas, I have to ask you something," Marcus said as they stood in the empty office. "Why did you choose that name? Affordable Wellness Pharmaceuticals?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the busy Chicago street below. "Because that's what was missing from my old company, and from most pharmaceutical companies," he replied finally. "They forgot that the whole point of medicine is wellness, helping people get better and stay healthy. Instead, they focused on maximizing profits from people's suffering." "And the affordable part?" "Because no one should have to choose between their medication and their rent. No one should have to ration insulin because they can't afford it. Medicine should heal, not bankrupt." As they locked up the office that evening, neither man realized they were closing the door on Thomas Bennett's old life forever. The next phase of their journey would bring challenges they couldn't imagine, enemies they didn't know existed, and a test of their values that would determine not just the success of their business, but the kind of men they would prove themselves to be. 18 months after Thomas Bennett had walked out of Chicago General Hospital as a homeless man, he found himself sitting in the boardroom of a gleaming downtown office building, facing some of the most powerful executives in the pharmaceutical industry. But he wasn't there as a supplicant. He was there as a competitor who was threatening their entire business model. The meeting had been arranged by David Morrison, the CEO of Morrison & Associates, a pharmaceutical consulting firm that specialized in market analysis and competitive intelligence. Morrison had been tracking affordable wellness pharmaceuticals' rapid growth with increasing alarm, and he wasn't alone. Several major pharmaceutical companies had begun to notice that their market share in generic medications was eroding in the Midwest, particularly in community health centers and independent pharmacies. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, addressing the assembled executives from 5 major pharmaceutical companies, "we have a problem. In the past year, a company that literally didn't exist 2 years ago has captured nearly 15% of the generic diabetes medication market in Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. They're expanding into heart medications and blood pressure drugs, and their growth rate is accelerating." Richard Blackwood, CEO of Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals, leaned forward with interest. Pinnacle was one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, with annual revenues exceeding $40 billion. Blackwood had built his reputation on aggressive acquisition strategies and ruthless competition elimination. "What's their secret?" Blackwood asked. "Better marketing, superior distribution, price," Morrison replied simply. "They're selling medications at prices that are 50 to 70% below current market rates, and somehow still maintaining profit margins." The room erupted in skeptical murmurs. Margaret Chen, CFO of Global Med Industries, shook her head dismissively. "That's impossible. We've done extensive cost analysis on generic drug production. There's no way a small company can achieve those kinds of price points and remain profitable." Morrison activated a presentation screen and displayed financial data that silenced the room. "This is Thomas Bennett," he said, showing a professional headshot of Thomas in a business suit. 2 years ago, he was homeless. Today, he's the CEO of a company that's projected to generate $50 million in revenue this year. The transformation visible in the photograph was remarkable. Thomas Bennett looked every inch the successful pharmaceutical executive. confident, well-dressed, and carrying himself with the authority of someone who had earned his position through merit and hard work. "How is this possible?" demanded Jonathan Sterling, the head of strategic planning for Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Morrison clicked to the next slide, showing a map of affordable wellness pharmaceuticals distribution network. Bennett identified a fundamental flaw in how we approach the generic drug market. While we've been focused on high-margin specialty medications, he's been building relationships with community health centers, independent pharmacies, and small hospital systems. Markets we've largely ignored because the individual contracts seemed too small to be profitable. The map showed an impressive network spanning across 7 states, with concentrations in underserved communities that major pharmaceutical companies typically overlooked. Each dot represents a client relationship that Thomas had built personally, often traveling hundreds of miles to meet with clinic directors and pharmacy owners who had been struggling with medication costs. "But the real problem," Morrison continued, "is that he's proving our pricing model is artificially inflated. His success is going to raise questions about why we charge so much more for the same medications." Blackwood's expression darkened. As someone who had spent decades maximizing pharmaceutical profits, the idea that a former homeless man was undermining the industry's pricing structure was both personally offensive and professionally threatening. "What do we know about his background?" Blackwood asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Morrison replied, clicking to a detailed biography slide. Bennett worked for Harwell Industries for 15 years before they laid him off during their 2019 restructuring. He was in their regulatory affairs department, which means he understands our approval processes better than most of our own employees. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Harwell Industries had been acquired by Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals 3 years earlier, meaning that Blackwood's own company had indirectly created their most dangerous competitor by discarding a valuable employee. "What's his weakness?" asked Chen. "Everyone has something: financial problems, regulatory violations, personal scandals." Morrison shook his head. "That's the problem. Bennett's operation is completely legitimate. His medications consistently test above FDA standards for quality and bioequivalence. His financial records are transparent. His employees are loyal and well-treated. There's no obvious angle of attack." The room fell silent as the executives absorbed the implications. They were facing a competitor who couldn't be discredited through the usual means: regulatory challenges, financial pressure, or character assassination. "What about his business model?" Sterling asked. "No one can maintain those prices indefinitely. He must be cutting corners somewhere." Morrison displayed a detailed analysis of affordable wellness pharmaceuticals operations. Actually, his model is brilliant in its simplicity. By focusing on high-volume, established medications and partnering with contract manufacturers, he's eliminated most of the overhead costs that we carry. He doesn't maintain expensive research facilities. He doesn't fund clinical trials for new drugs, and he doesn't have layers of executives and administrative staff. Plus, Morrison continued, he's built genuine loyalty among his clients. The community health centers aren't just buying from him because of price. They're buying because he's proven reliable, responsive, and genuinely committed to their missions. Blackwood stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. In the distance, he could see the neighborhood where Thomas's first office had been located, though he didn't know the significance of the view. "Gentlemen, this isn't just about market share," Blackwood said finally. "If Bennett's model proves sustainable and replicable, it could fundamentally change how the pharmaceutical industry operates. Other entrepreneurs will start copying his approach. Politicians will start asking why we can't provide medications at his prices. Patients will start demanding affordable alternatives to everything we sell." Margaret Chen nodded grimly. "It's a potential existential threat to our entire pricing structure. So what do we do?" asked Sterling. Blackwood turned back to face the room, his expression cold and calculating. "We eliminate the threat. Morrison, I want you to dig deeper into Bennett's operation. Find something we can use. Regulatory violations, patent infringements, quality control issues, anything. No business is perfect. And if we don't find anything, then we create something," Blackwood replied matter-of-factly. "The pharmaceutical industry generates over $1 trillion annually. We don't maintain those profits by allowing disruptors to fundamentally alter our business model." Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Blackwood, are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting we use every legal means at our disposal to protect our industry," Blackwood interrupted. "Intensive regulatory scrutiny, competitive pressure on his suppliers, strategic challenges to his distribution partnerships, standard business practices." The other executives exchanged glances. They all understood that Blackwood's definition of standard business practices often stretched well beyond what most people would consider ethical or appropriate. "What about the optics?" Chen asked carefully. "A group of major pharmaceutical companies targeting a business that's trying to make medications more affordable. That could generate negative publicity." "Only if it becomes public," Blackwood replied with a thin smile. "And I don't see any reason why it would, as long as we're all on the same page about the importance of maintaining industry stability." As the meeting concluded and the executives filed out of the boardroom, none of them realized they were making a decision that would ultimately lead to one of the most dramatic confrontations in corporate history. They saw Thomas Bennett as a threat to be eliminated, not recognizing that they were about to challenge a man who had already lost everything once and rebuilt his life from nothing. Thomas Bennett had survived homelessness, rebuilt a successful business, and earned the respect of communities across the Midwest. He had no intention of allowing the industry that had once discarded him to destroy what he had built. The war they were starting would test not just his business acumen, but his character, his values, and his determination to prove that success didn't have to come at the expense of human dignity. The first strike came on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in October. Thomas Bennett was reviewing quarterly distribution reports in his expanded office space when his assistant, Maria Santos, burst through the door with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Mr. Bennett, we have a problem. The FDA is here." Thomas looked up from his paperwork, immediately alert. "What do you mean, here?" "3 investigators. They have a warrant for a comprehensive inspection of our operations. They're already in the warehouse, pulling samples from our current inventory." Thomas felt his stomach drop, but forced himself to remain calm. FDA inspections weren't unusual in the pharmaceutical industry, but the timing and scope of this one felt suspicious. Affordable Wellness Pharmaceuticals had been operating for 2 years without any regulatory issues, and their quality control records were immaculate. "Did they say what triggered the inspection?" Maria handed him an official document. "They received an anonymous complaint alleging quality control violations and potential contamination issues with our metformin production." Thomas scanned the document with a growing alarm. The complaint was detailed and specific, citing lot numbers, manufacturing dates, and technical specifications that suggested the complainant had intimate knowledge of their operations. But more troubling was the fact that the allegations were completely false. Thomas knew his quality control procedures better than anyone, and their manufacturing partner in Indiana maintained FDA-certified facilities with spotless inspection records. "Maria, call our attorney immediately, then contact Dr. Williams and let him know what's happening. I have a feeling this is just the beginning." Thomas was right. Over the next 3 hours, the FDA investigators conducted the most thorough inspection in the company's history. They tested product samples, reviewed every quality control document, interviewed staff members, and scrutinized manufacturing protocols with an intensity that seemed excessive for a routine inspection. Meanwhile, Thomas received a phone call that confirmed his worst suspicions. Roberto Rodriguez was calling from the community health center, and his voice was tight with frustration. "Thomas, I just got off the phone with our pharmaceutical supplier. Someone has been calling our vendors, spreading rumors that Affordable Wellness is facing FDA sanctions and potential shutdown. 3 of our suppliers have already terminated their contracts with us, effective immediately." "What kind of rumors?" "That your medications are contaminated, that you're operating without proper licenses, that the FDA is preparing to seize your inventory. It's all complete nonsense, but it's causing panic among our supply chain partners." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't a random regulatory inspection. It was a coordinated attack designed to destroy his business through regulatory pressure and supply chain disruption. The situation deteriorated rapidly throughout the week. On Wednesday, Thomas discovered that someone had filed patent infringement lawsuits against Affordable Wellness Pharmaceuticals in 3 different federal court districts. The lawsuits claimed that Thomas's generic formulations violated obscure patents held by major pharmaceutical companies, even though the medications he was producing had been off patent for decades. By Thursday, the company's primary banking relationship was under attack. First National Bank of Chicago called to inform Thomas that they were conducting an enhanced due diligence review of Affordable Wellness's accounts based on regulatory concerns that had been brought to their attention. The review would freeze all business accounts pending completion of their investigation. "Mr. Bennett," explained Janet Walsh, the bank's vice president for commercial accounts, "we've received information suggesting that your company may be facing significant regulatory sanctions. As a federally regulated institution, we have an obligation to ensure that we're not facilitating potentially illegal activities." Thomas knew exactly what was happening, but proving it would be nearly impossible. Someone with significant resources and industry connections was systematically attacking every aspect of his business using tactics that appeared legitimate on the surface, but were clearly coordinated and malicious in intent. The crisis reached its peak on Friday afternoon when Thomas received a call from his manufacturing partner in Indiana. Jim Peterson, the owner of Midwest Generic Manufacturing, sounded genuinely apologetic but firm in his decision. "Thomas, I'm sorry, but I have to terminate our manufacturing agreement, effective immediately. I've been contacted by multiple pharmaceutical companies offering to buy out our entire production capacity for the next 2 years. The offer is too good to refuse, and frankly, I can't afford to turn it down. Jim, we have a contract. You can't just walk away because someone offered you more money." "Actually, I can. There's a clause in our agreement that allows either party to terminate with 30 days' notice in the event of material changes in business circumstances. The FDA inspection of your company and the pending litigation qualify as material changes." Thomas realized that his opponents had anticipated every move. They had studied his business model, identified his vulnerabilities, and launched a multifaceted attack designed to cripple his operations while maintaining plausible deniability. That evening, Thomas sat in his office as the sun set over Chicago, surrounded by the debris of what had been a thriving business just 1 week earlier. His inventory was frozen pending FDA review. His bank accounts were inaccessible. His manufacturing partner had terminated their agreement, and his legal defense costs were mounting rapidly. Marcus Williams found him there at 9 o'clock, staring out the window at the city lights. "How bad is it?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from Thomas's desk. "They're going to win," Thomas replied quietly. "Whoever is behind this, they've done their homework. They've attacked us on every front simultaneously, and I don't have the resources to fight back effectively. Who do you think is responsible? Thomas pulled out a folder he had been compiling throughout the week. I've been tracking the timeline and the tactics. The patent lawsuits were filed by law firms that specialize in pharmaceutical litigation. The FDA complaint contained technical details that only someone with inside knowledge of our operations could have known. The banking pressure came through channels that suggest federal regulatory influence. So it's one of the major pharmaceutical companies? Not just one. This feels like a coordinated effort involving multiple companies, possibly with government connections. They're not just trying to put me out of business, they're trying to make an example of me, to show other potential competitors what happens when you challenge the industry's pricing structure. Marcus studied his friend's face, seeing the exhaustion and frustration, but also something else, a determination that reminded him of the night they had first met in the emergency room. Thomas, what are you going to do? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a business card that Marcus recognized. It was the card Marcus had given him in the hospital 2.5 years earlier. You told me once that everyone deserves someone who cares and everyone deserves a chance to rebuild, Thomas said. Well, I've rebuilt it once already, and I'm not going to let them destroy what we've built without a fight. What do you mean? Thomas stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, retrieving a thick folder marked Emergency Contingency Plans. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry long enough to know that this kind of attack was always a possibility. I've been preparing for it from the beginning. He opened the folder, revealing documents that made Marcus's eyes widen in surprise. Inside were business registration papers for subsidiary companies in multiple states, backup manufacturing agreements with facilities in Canada and Mexico, and offshore banking arrangements that would be immune to domestic regulatory pressure. Thomas, this is what survival looks like in an industry that values profit over people, Thomas replied. They think they can destroy me the same way they discarded me 3 years ago. But I'm not the same person I was then. I've learned their tactics, I understand their weaknesses, and I've prepared for their attacks. Thomas closed the folder and looked directly at Marcus. They want a war? They're going to get one. And when it's over, they're going to discover that underestimating a man who's already lost everything once was the biggest mistake they ever made. Outside the office windows, Chicago's lights twinkled in the darkness, unaware that one of the most decisive corporate battles in pharmaceutical history was about to begin. Thomas Bennett had been counted out before, but he had never stayed down, and this time he had allies, resources, and most importantly, a cause worth fighting for that extended far beyond his own success. Affordable, ethical medicine could change everything. The first strike came on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in October. Thomas Bennett was reviewing quarterly distribution reports in his expanded office space when his assistant, Maria Santos, burst through the door with an expression of barely controlled panic. Mr. Bennett, we have a problem. The FDA is here. Thomas looked up from his paperwork, immediately alert. What do you mean, here? 3 investigators. They have a warrant for a comprehensive inspection of our operations. They're already in the warehouse, pulling samples from our current inventory. Thomas felt his stomach drop, but forced himself to remain calm. FDA inspections weren't unusual in the pharmaceutical industry, but the timing and scope of this one felt suspicious. Affordable Wellness Pharmaceuticals had been operating for 2 years without any regulatory issues, and their quality control records were immaculate. Did they say what triggered the inspection? Maria handed him an official document. They received an anonymous complaint alleging quality control violations and potential contamination issues with our metformin production. Thomas scanned the document with a growing alarm. The complaint was detailed and specific, citing lot numbers, manufacturing dates, and technical specifications that suggested the complainant had intimate knowledge of their operations. But more troubling was the fact that the allegations were completely false. Thomas knew his quality control procedures better than anyone, and their manufacturing partner in Indiana maintained FDA-certified facilities with spotless inspection. Records. Maria, call our attorney immediately, then contact Dr. Williams and let him know what's happening. I have a feeling this is just the beginning. Thomas was right. Over the next 3 hours, the FDA investigators conducted the most thorough inspection in the company's history. They tested product samples, reviewed every quality control document, interviewed staff members, and scrutinized manufacturing protocols with an intensity that seemed excessive for a routine inspection. Meanwhile, Thomas received a phone call that confirmed his worst suspicions. Roberto Rodriguez was calling from the Community Health Center, and his voice was tight with frustration. Thomas, I just got off the phone with our pharmaceutical supplier. Someone has been calling our vendors, spreading rumors that affordable wellness is facing FDA sanctions and potential shutdown. 3 of our suppliers have already terminated their contracts with us, effective immediately. What kind of rumors? That your medications are contaminated, that you're operating without proper licenses, that the FDA is preparing to seize your inventory. It's all complete nonsense, but it's causing panic among our supply chain partners. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't a random regulatory inspection. It was a coordinated attack designed to destroy his business through regulatory pressure and supply chain disruption. The situation deteriorated rapidly throughout the week. On Wednesday, Thomas discovered that someone had filed patent infringement lawsuits against Affordable Wellness Pharmaceuticals in 3 different federal court districts. The lawsuits claimed that Thomas's generic formulations violated obscure patents held by major pharmaceutical companies, even though the medications he was producing had been off-patent for decades. By Thursday, the company's primary banking relationship was under attack. First National Bank of Chicago called to inform Thomas that they were conducting an enhanced due diligence review of Affordable Wellness's accounts, based on regulatory concerns that had been brought to their attention. The review would freeze all business accounts pending completion of their investigation. Mr. Bennett, explained Janet Walsh, the bank's vice president for commercial accounts. We've received information suggesting that your company may be facing significant regulatory sanctions. As a federally regulated institution, we have an obligation to ensure that we're not facilitating potentially illegal activities. Thomas knew exactly what was happening, but proving it would be nearly impossible. Someone with significant resources and industry connections was systematically attacking every aspect of his business, using tactics that appeared legitimate on the surface, but were clearly coordinated and malicious in intent. The crisis reached its peak on Friday afternoon when Thomas received a call from his manufacturing partner in Indiana. Jim Peterson, the owner of Midwest Generic Manufacturing, sounded genuinely apologetic but firm in his decision. Thomas, I'm sorry, but I have to terminate our manufacturing agreement, effective immediately. I've been contacted by multiple pharmaceutical companies offering to buy out our entire production capacity for the next 2 years. The offer is too good to refuse, and frankly, I can't afford to turn it down. Jim, we have a contract. You can't just walk away because someone offered you more money. Actually, I can. There's a clause in our agreement that allows either party to terminate with 30 days' notice in the event of material changes in business circumstances. The FDA inspection of your company and the pending litigation qualify as material changes. Thomas realized that his opponents had anticipated every move. They had studied his business model, identified his vulnerabilities, and launched a multifaceted attack designed to cripple his operations while maintaining plausible deniability. That evening, Thomas sat in his office as the sun set over Chicago, surrounded by the debris of what had been a thriving business just 1 week earlier. His inventory was frozen pending FDA review, his bank accounts were inaccessible, his manufacturing partner had terminated their agreement, and his legal defense costs were mounting rapidly. Marcus Williams found him there at 9 o'clock, staring out the window at the city lights. "How bad is it?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from Thomas's desk. "They're going to win," Thomas replied quietly. "Whoever is behind this, they've done their homework. They've attacked us on every front simultaneously, and I don't have the resources to fight back effectively. Who do you think is responsible?" Thomas pulled out a folder he had been compiling throughout the week. "I've been tracking the timeline and the tactics. The patent lawsuits were filed by law firms that specialize in pharmaceutical litigation. The FDA complaint contained technical details that only someone with inside knowledge of our operations could have known. The banking pressure came through channels that suggest federal regulatory influence. So it's one of the major pharmaceutical companies? Not just one. This feels like a coordinated effort involving multiple companies, possibly with government connections. They're not just trying to put me out of business. They're trying to make an example of me, to show other potential competitors what happens when you challenge the industry's pricing structure." Marcus studied his friend's face, seeing the exhaustion and frustration, but also something else, a determination that reminded him of the night they had first met in the emergency room. "Thomas, what are you going to do?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a business card that Marcus recognized. It was the card Marcus had given him in the hospital 2.5 years earlier. "You told me once that everyone deserves someone who cares, and everyone deserves a chance to rebuild," Thomas said. "Well, I've rebuilt it once already, and I'm not going to let them destroy what we've built without a fight." "What do you mean?" Thomas stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, retrieving a thick folder marked Emergency Contingency Plans. "I've been in the pharmaceutical industry long enough to know that this kind of attack was always a possibility. I've been preparing for it from the beginning." He opened the folder, revealing documents that made Marcus's eyes widen in surprise. Inside were business registration papers for subsidiary companies in multiple states, backup manufacturing agreements with facilities in Canada and Mexico, and offshore banking arrangements that would be immune to domestic regulatory pressure. "Thomas, this is what survival looks like in an industry that values profit over people," Thomas replied. "They think they can destroy me the same way they discarded me 3 years ago. But I'm not the same person I was then. I've learned their tactics, I understand their weaknesses, and I've prepared for their attacks." Thomas closed the folder and looked directly at Marcus. "They want a war, they're going to get one. And when it's over, they're going to discover that underestimating a man who's already lost everything once was the biggest mistake they ever made." Outside the office windows, Chicago's lights twinkled in the darkness, unaware that one of the most decisive corporate battles in pharmaceutical history was about to begin. Thomas Bennett had been counted out before, but he had never stayed down. And this time he had allies, resources, and most importantly, a cause worth fighting for that extended far beyond his own success. 6 months later, Richard Blackwood sat in his executive conference room at Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals, but this time he wasn't the one calling the shots. Across from him sat Thomas Bennett, now dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, flanked by a team of lawyers and investment bankers that would have impressed even the most seasoned corporate executives. The transformation wasn't just in Thomas's appearance. Affordable Wellness Pharmaceuticals had not only survived the coordinated attack, it had emerged stronger than ever. The contingency plans Thomas had secretly developed had activated seamlessly when the assault began, creating a multinational pharmaceutical operation that was virtually immune to domestic regulatory manipulation. "Mr. Blackwood," Thomas began, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who held all the cards. "I believe you wanted to discuss our acquisition offer." The irony of the situation was lost on no one in the room. 6 months earlier, Blackwood had orchestrated a campaign to destroy Thomas's company. Now, Thomas was sitting in Blackwood's boardroom, offering to buy Pinnacle Pharmaceutical's entire generic drug division for $12 billion. The reversal of fortune had been swift and devastating for the pharmaceutical giants who had underestimated their opponent. While they had focused their attacks on Affordable Wellness's domestic operations, Thomas had quietly activated manufacturing partnerships in Canada, Ireland, and India. When his US suppliers were pressured to terminate their contracts, Thomas simply shifted production overseas and began importing finished medications at prices that were still far below his American competitors. But the real masterstroke had come when Thomas decided to go public with what had happened to his company. Instead of fighting the battle in corporate boardrooms and courtrooms, he had taken his story directly to the American people. The press conference that changed everything had taken place on the steps of the Chicago courthouse, where the patent infringement lawsuits were being heard. Thomas had stood before a crowd of reporters, patients, and community health advocates, and told his story with a clarity and passion that resonated far beyond the pharmaceutical industry. 3 years ago, I was homeless, living on the streets of this city, Thomas had said, looking directly into the television cameras. Dr. Marcus Williams treated my wounds in the emergency room of Chicago General Hospital, not because I could pay, but because he believed every human being deserves dignity and care. That experience taught me that medicine should heal, not bankrupt. Thomas had then revealed the coordinated campaign that major pharmaceutical companies had launched against Affordable Wellness, complete with documented evidence of the false FDA complaints, manipulated patent lawsuits, and supply chain interference. But more importantly, he had explained why they had targeted him. They attacked my company because we proved that life-saving medications can be produced and sold at fair prices while still maintaining healthy profits. Our success threatened their ability to charge desperate patients thousands of dollars for medications that cost pennies to produce. The public response had been immediate and overwhelming. Patient advocacy groups rallied to Thomas's cause. Congressional representatives demanded investigations into pharmaceutical industry pricing practices. Most critically, major institutional investors began questioning whether the traditional pharmaceutical business model was sustainable in an era of increasing public scrutiny. The financial markets had responded decisively. Within weeks of Thomas's press conference, Pinnacle Pharmaceutical's stock price had dropped by 30%. Other major pharmaceutical companies faced similar declines as investors worried about regulatory changes and public backlash. Meanwhile, Affordable Wellness Pharmaceuticals had attracted investment interest from some of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds and pension systems. These institutional investors weren't just attracted by the company's profitability. They were drawn to its mission of providing affordable healthcare solutions to underserved populations. The influx of capital had allowed Thomas to expand operations rapidly. Affordable Wellness now operated manufacturing facilities on 3 continents and supplied medications to over 2,000 healthcare providers across North America and Europe. More importantly, the company had maintained its commitment to affordable pricing while achieving profit margins that proved sustainable. Pharmaceutical businesses didn't require exploitative pricing structures. Now, sitting across from Blackwood, Thomas was offering to complete the transformation of the pharmaceutical industry by acquiring the assets of the companies that had tried to destroy him. "Our offer is fair and generous," Thomas continued, sliding a bound proposal across the conference table. We're prepared to pay full market value for your generic drug manufacturing facilities, your distribution networks, and your existing supply. In contracts, your shareholders will receive a significant premium over current stock prices. Blackwood's lawyer, Patricia Kane, leaned forward to study the documents. Mr. Bennett, this is essentially a hostile takeover disguised as a friendly acquisition offer. Thomas smiled. Miss Kane, I prefer to think of it as a market correction. For too long, the pharmaceutical industry has operated on the assumption that patients have no choice but to pay whatever prices are demanded for life-saving medications. We've proven that assumption is wrong. Margaret Chen, who had joined the meeting as Pinnacle's CFO, spoke for the first time. Even if we were inclined to accept your offer, what guarantee do we have that you'll maintain our current operations? You could simply shut down our facilities and eliminate the competition. An excellent question, Thomas replied, opening another folder. Which is why our offer includes binding commitments to maintain all current employment levels for a minimum of 5 years, and to continue supplying medications to all existing customers at prices no higher than current affordable wellness rates. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Thomas wasn't just buying his competitors, he was converting them to his business model. Every acquisition would result in immediate price reductions for thousands of patients while maintaining your profitability and employment. Dr. Marcus Williams, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, finally spoke. Mr. Blackwood, you might be interested to know that 27 state attorneys general have announced their intention to investigate pharmaceutical pricing practices in their jurisdictions. The federal government is considering legislation that would allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices directly. The industry is changing, whether you participate or not. Blackwood looked around the room, seeing the writing on the wall. The pharmaceutical industry's traditional pricing model was under assault from multiple directions. Regulatory pressure, public opinion, investor concerns, and most critically, proof that alternative approaches could be both profitable and sustainable. What happens if we refuse your offer? Blackwood asked. Thomas leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. Then you continue operating as you always have, while we continue expanding our market share. But I should mention that we're announcing next week that we've secured partnerships with 3 major health insurance companies to provide preferred pricing for our medications. We estimate that we'll add another 40% to our market reach within the next year. The final blow was delivered with characteristic understatement, but everyone in the room understood its significance. If major insurance companies began steering patients toward affordable wellness medications through lower copays and preferred formulary status, traditional pharmaceutical companies would face an exodus of customers that could destroy their profitability within months. 2 hours later, the preliminary agreement was signed. Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals would sell its generic drug division to affordable wellness pharmaceuticals for $12 billion, with the transaction structured to immediately reduce medication prices for millions of patients. As the lawyers and executives filed out of the boardroom, Thomas and Marcus found themselves alone for the first time since the meeting began. 3.5 years ago, you were treating my wounds in an emergency room, Thomas said quietly. Did you ever imagine it would lead to this? Marcus shook his head in amazement. Honestly, no, I just saw someone who needed help. And that's exactly why this worked, Thomas replied. You didn't see a homeless man who deserved his situation. You saw a human being who deserved dignity and care. That perspective changed everything. Outside the conference room windows, Chicago stretched out before them, the same city where Thomas had once slept in doorways and Marcus had worked endless shifts trying to heal a broken world, one patient at a time. Now, their partnership had fundamentally altered an industry that affected millions of lives. The transformation was far from complete. There would be more battles to fight, more companies to convince or acquire, and more patients to serve. But the precedent had been established. The pharmaceutical industry could be profitable without being predatory, successful without being cruel. Thomas Bennett had journeyed from homelessness to corporate boardrooms, but the most important part of his story wasn't his personal success. It was proof that one person's compassion, extended to another person in their darkest moment, could ultimately change the world in ways neither of them had ever imagined possible. In the end, the homeless man had indeed returned as a pharmaceutical CEO, but he had returned not for revenge, but for redemption, not just his own, but for an entire industry that had lost its way. And in doing so, he had honored the simple act of kindness that had started it all. One human being caring for another without expecting anything in return. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.